The topic of tonight's Iggeres Hakodesh, tonight's class, is humility. Zanov. This is the second letter in the Tanya, and it's a relatively speaking short letter. It's one page. And the Alter Rebbe here talks about the idea of humility. There's a context to this discussion, a historical context, a practical context, which we'll get to soon. But let me begin with an introduction. The previous Rebbe has memoirs. The Friedrich Lubavitcher, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, wrote memoirs. He wrote them in Hebrew, and they were translated and developed and dramatized in Yiddish by a writer named Meckler. And they've been since published in Yiddish and then translated back into Hebrew and into English and so on. The memoirs of the previous Rebbe are supposed to be the history of Lubavitch, but it actually discusses everything until Lubavitch. In other words, you never actually get to Lubavitch. What he does is he goes back in history several hundred years to the origins of the city of Lubavitch itself. And I would say that the most dominant aspect of this, it's 2 volumes of memoirs, and I would strongly encourage you to get them and read them. They're really full of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. They really are incredibly inspiring books. They're full of real wonderful faith and joy of Judaism. They're very, very, very inspirational books. English? You can buy them in English. The Lubavitcher Rebbe's memoirs, Yiddish, English, Hebrew. So the bulk of these volumes talk about the Alter Rebbe's father, the Tanya's author, the author of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe's father, in a Baruch, and his wanderings as a young man. And one of the stories you have in this volume is that he used to visit a city called Dobre Misl. You never heard of Dobre Misl? Don't worry about. Neither have I. Dobre Misl is a shtetl, someplace on the other side of the pond. And Baruch, who was Alter Rebbe's father, who was a teenage orphan, he lost his parents at the age of 14. He left home. He wandered around. Had a habit of ending up in Dobre Misl for special occasions. He would come there for Pesach. He would come there for Sukkot. He liked to hang around in this shtetl Dobre Misl. Part of the reason he liked coming to this village of Dobre Misl is because people left him alone. He was a very big scholar. He was a very holy person, a very pious person. And he wanted to be treated like everybody else. And sometimes he would come to a place, they would try to give him attention, and he would disappear. In Dobre Misl, he was treated like one of the guys. And he had a regular haunt, a regular place where he hung out. One of the regular places that this Baruch, Alter Rebbe's father, liked to frequent was the house of a Jew by the name of Reuven the blacksmith, Reuven the Schmid. Reuven the blacksmith was a very simple man. But he had been influenced by the Baal Shem Tov's teachings while still a hidden tzaddik. And as a consequence, this Reuven the blacksmith had taken a lead, taken an example from the Baal Shem Tov's followers and their inspiration. And one of the things that he did, this Reuven the blacksmith's mother, when it came time for him to find son-in-laws for his daughters, husbands for his daughters, he chose B'nai Torah, he chose Talmidei Chachamim, he chose scholars, which was not so common. Simple people in Russia, which was the part of Europe which had been so devastated by all the tzaddiks, people were very simple, people were very ignorant, and he went special to yeshivas and he found 3 son-in-laws who were B'nai Torah. And his son-in-laws were from the first big lomdim in that era at that time, and later on big yeshivas would be built and so forth, but this was like a big deal. His children were Talmidei Chachamim. In fact, he had a son, he had 3 daughters and a son. When his son became of age, he actually sent him away to a yeshiva, which is almost unheard of then. The Baruch would come to this Reuven's house because he liked to observe his son-in-laws. Because in the son-in-laws of Rabbi Reuven, the Baruch was able to observe 2 worlds. Because Hasidus was very, very new at the time, was brand new. In other words, the Baal Shem Tov had just very recently made his appearance on the scene of the Jewish Eastern European world. He had been a hidden tzaddik, and the official date of the Baal Shem Tov revealing himself is 1734. You're talking probably now around 1740, 1739. And he already had a following. Amongst the following of the Baal Shem Tov was the youngest of the 3 son-in-laws of this Reuven the Schmid, the blacksmith, Rabbi Nissen's name was Yitzchak Shol. His father, Rabbi Nissen, was a chassid from the Baal Shem Tov when he was still a hidden tzaddik. He was a melamed in a city called Harki. If you don't know where Harki is, don't worry about it, neither do I. And he was able to observe the two worlds. He was able to have a clear juxtaposition of the old traditional style of Talmid HaChamim, of rabbi, of scholar, of learned Jew, juxtaposed against the new Hasidic-inspired type of scholar. And the most obvious distinction was their assimilation with the common people. B'nai Torah, scholars, learned people, didn't associate with common people. In Hasidus, there was a much greater warmth, much greater availability, a much greater generosity, a much greater embracing, a much greater sense of being one between the Talmid Chachamim, the B'nai Torah, the big rabbis and the common people, even if the rabbis were very great, because this is one of the most important teachings of all of Hasidus, is that you never know who's greater. The simple person's simplicity may exceed the great person's scholarship and greatness and so forth. So Rabbi Baruch would visit Dabre Misl all the time, because to him he was a young man trying to choose for himself a path. And in this home he had played out before him these two worlds, and he could witness them close up, one against the next, and it put him in a position to choose which path he would ultimately decide for himself. And of course the end of the story was he became the Baal Shem Tov as a follower, as the Alter Rebbe's father. But here's one of the little stories that happened during these frequent trips to Dabre Misl. It was Simchas Torah. And Rabbi Yitzchak Shol was not above a practical joke. Well, he was a very big Talmud Chacham, he was a very pious man, but he wasn't stiff. He knew how to laugh. So by the Hakofis, on the night of Simchas Torah, he goes over to the Gabbai, to the person in charge of the Aliyas, the one who announces who gets what honor. And he says to the Gabbai, he says, the next Hakofa, the dads with the Hakofa 7 times, he says, the next Hakofa will be the 4th Hakofa. I want you to announce that you're offering the first Sefer Torah of the 4th Hakofa to the humblest man in town. To the biggest honor, to the humblest man in town. So the Gabbai understood right away this was a practical joke that was quite impractical. And he told Yitzchak Shol to go fly a kite. He says, that's not going to work, it's going to hurt people's feelings. The city is going to be up in arms. He says, don't be afraid, it's Simchas Torah, let's have a laugh. Just do what I'm asking you. Announce that the first Sefer Torah, the 4th Hakofa, has been given to the humblest man in town. And he worked him over as a good, and he convinced him. So the Gabbai gets up, and he bangs on the bima after the 3rd Hakofa, the 3rd dance with the Sefer Torah finishes, and he announces the first Sefer Torah, the 4th Hakofa, is being honored to the humblest person in town. And from every direction, people came running to the Sefer Torah. 5, 6 people came running over to the Sefer Torah, which is, of course, a problem. The Baruch watches this, and listen, the Yitzchak Shol had told him, watch what's going to happen. The following morning, they meet in the mikveh an old Jew, who was also amongst those who had run to the Sefer Torah. Said Baruch says to him, the Yitzchak Shol tells him, it's evidenced that you are the 3rd humblest man in all of Dabre Misl. He says, I'm the 3rd humblest man of Dabre Misl. I'm the humblest man of Dabre Misl. He says, well, you were the 3rd one to approach the Sefer Torah. You must be the 3rd of the humblest. He says, no, that's because they have no respect. I'm old and I got arthritis. My legs don't go. I'm really the humblest person in town. I just didn't get there in time. This was the story. Now, it's a joke. It's a practical joke. But it's a practical joke that has a great worth. It has a great value. The previous Rebbe has a letter, which is very long. It's well over 100 pages, which he wrote to his daughter. And we now know that he wrote it to his daughter, he sent it to her, and told her to read it and send it back to him. But he sent it to her. And it's a very, very long letter. That letter also, like the memoirs, talks about the very first Hasidic leaders in Russia, in White Russia, which was one of the later places the Hasidus took roots. And one of the stories in that long, long letter is a story about a Jew by the name of Reb Mordechai, who's having these flashbacks. He had become a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, and he was sitting and imagining himself before he became a Chassid. And one of the memories that he has was his sense of self. He says he was a Talmud Chacham, was a scholar, very learned man, but he was also very secretive. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't announce himself. People had no idea how great he was. And he used to think to himself that he must be so humble, that there's never been a man humbler than himself in the history of the world. And once it came to Pashas Ba'aloischa, which is in the book of Numbers, where the Torah describes Moshe Rabbeinu as being the humblest man. And he was in one of those moods where he was sitting in him, imagining how God is going to be happy to greet him when he dies, and he's going to tell him that you are the humblest man who ever was, such a great rabbi, such a great scholar, such a pious person that nobody even knows. And they gave him that aliyah, that part of the Torah, Shvi, where the Torah says that Moshe Rabbeinu is the humblest man. He's holding the Sefer Torah and thinking to himself, how could it say in the Torah that Moshe is the humblest man? I know I'm humbler than Moshe Rabbeinu. And then he concluded that really I'm humble than Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah is not revealing how humble I am because the Torah is honoring my secrecy. Moshe Rabbeinu was the humblest person. The people knew how humble he was, but I'm actually humbler. And he's reflecting on this. He's recalling all of this. And he's thinking how silly he was, how preoccupied, how caught up he was with himself. In other words, humility is not always humility. There's an incredible difference between acting humble and being humble. And the difference is not only how humble one is, but in some cases the act of humility is the epitome of arrogance and conceit and self-absorption. And real humility doesn't always look so humble. Humility is not what you do. Humility is who you are. And there's an incredible difference between the two. And sometimes you meet people who are really, really into being humble, and to use an old Hasidic expression, as stinkt van sie, which means in English, they stink. They're so full of themselves. They're so busy being humble, there's no space for God. In other words, the humility is the antithesis, is the exact opposite of what humility means, and humility is, for real, what humility is in truth. And it's really, really true that sometimes you meet a person who will give you the impression of being very arrogant, very confident, very self-assured, and he's a very humble person. And sometimes you meet a person who acts very humble and he's so busy with himself. It's the old adage, just take a needle and poke it into the balloon and see what happens. When we were kids, I was in yeshiva, so I had the good fortune of having Elter Bach. And I was a boy, and I was 14, 15 years old, I was away from home. So they were older yeshiva boys who used to, shluchim they were called, who used to help us out and talk to us and try to get us to listen to them. I mean, if I could get over myself in those days and listen to another person, that was a big miracle. I was very, very busy with myself when I was a teenager. And he told me an interesting insight. He says, you walk into a very, very expensive restaurant, and there's a very, very, very fancy, sophisticated couple that walks into this restaurant, and they order a $200 meal. I guess today that's not a lot of money, but in the 1980s that was a considerable amount of money. And they sit so respectfully, and they put napkins in their collars, and they eat very slowly, and they talk, and they laugh, and they drink wine, and they clatter dishes, and they sit there, and it's a whole big deal. And a homeless person walks in, and the proprietor, the owner of the restaurant, gives him a free meal. So you have this very, very classy couple that's paying for its meal, that's sitting and eating so respectfully, and then next to them, or a couple of tables over in the corner, you have this homeless guy with 4 coats on, sitting, eating with his hands, wolfing the food down with both of his hands. He says, so who's the bigger glutton? This was the way the question was proposed to me when I was 15 or 16 years old. Who's the bigger Baltaiva? Who's more indulgent? If you look at it, clearly, the second person he's eating with both hands, he's filthy, and he has no patience, he's wolfing it down, he can't even chew the food, he's swallowing it so fast. And they're eating so elegantly and so respectfully and so finely and with so much class and so much dignity and so much etiquette. So who's more immersed? Who's more preoccupied with their food? It would seem that that this homeless person is more preoccupied. But everybody knows that that's the wrong answer. Everybody knows that the other answer is, how do you prove it? He says, go over to these 2 groups of people and take their food away from them and watch them react. You go over to the homeless person, take his food, he'll say, Hashem nothing, Hashem lakach, Hashem averech matav. God gave, God took, may God be blessed. You go over to those very important people and take their food away, the roof will come off the place. Who do you think you are, and do you know who we are, and so on and so forth. In other words, appearances are not necessarily what is real. Frequently, the one who appears to be humble is nothing but preoccupied with self, and the one who appears to be preoccupied with self is actually very, very humble. So how do you determine that? How do you know whether a person is humble or not humble? And by the way, we're not in the business of testing other people. The only person we need to test is ourselves. How do we determine for ourselves whether we have capacity for humility or we preoccupy with self? There's a very, very real and useful and practical measure. And the measure is not how humble you act or how humble you're perceived. The measure is very simple. The symptom of humility is that you invite others into your life. And the symptom of arrogance is that you push other people away. In physics, they use words phobic and philic. Some substances in chemistry and in physics are philic, means that they are embracing. They invite other things in. And other substances, other chemicals are phobic. They push other things away, like two the same poles of a magnet versus opposite poles. One draws and one pushes away, one repels. So the English words are phobic and philic. So a person could act so self-assured, so confident, and so forthcoming, and he looks so full of himself. But when you meet this person, he's nice to everybody. That's a humble person. And another person who talks in a whisper, he doesn't assert himself, he's very, very pious, but in his space there's no room for anybody else, that person is completely preoccupied with himself. So arrogance and humility are not always what they appear. Arrogance and humility really are what's going on inside, not what's going on the outside. Now, having, so to speak, given you a bit of an introduction, let's now get to this letter, this very short but important letter here in the Tanya. This is a letter which the Alter Rebbe wrote after he was released from prison. The date is 1796. 1798, 1800. It's very, very difficult for us, from our perspective, to appreciate what was going on then. But to be sure, there was a very, very serious war. I mean, it was certainly a war of ideas in the Jewish world. And in a sentence, the war came down to, is Hasidus Judaism or is Hasidus not Judaism? Obviously Hasidim held that not only is Hasidus Judaism, Hasidus is the revitalization of Judaism. Hasidus is the rejuvenation. You know how you spell rejuvenation? R-E-J-E-W. Venation. It's creating a freshness and a youthfulness and an initiative which was very, very necessary then, even though there was so much Yiddishkeit and so much Torah and so much scholarship. Something new needed to be introduced, and Hasidus was that new thing. On the other side of the coin, you had the Misnagdim who were claiming that Hasidus is a new religion, and they're stepping outside the pales and the boundaries of Judaism, and that all their issues and all their complaints, which, to be very direct and honest, they're a waste of time, so I'm not going to give them to you. But it was a very serious issue. It wasn't simply a matter of which rabbi is going to give the hechsher on the chicken. It literally came down to, is this Judaism and are these Jews? And the Misnagdim tried for a very, very long time to destroy Hasidus. I would say the very intense battle that took place then lasted approximately 70 years. 70 years. 70 years is how many generations? It's 3.5 generations. It's a very, very long time. From the times of the Baal Shem Tov to the times of the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. Eventually, Hasidim and Misnagdim not only made peace, they became best friends. But you're not supposed to be honest, right? But I'll be honest anyway. You know who made peace with Hasidim and Misnagdim? Who gets credit for making peace with Hasidim and Misnagdim? The Reform movement. Because all of a sudden our differences didn't matter. When the Reform movement came to Eastern Europe, and they were an avalanche, they were a tsunami that had swept through Eastern Europe and destroyed Yiddishkeit. And now they had been making effort after effort, salvo after salvo, bomb after bomb, attack after attack, until they penetrated the walls of Eastern Europe. And it was the Hasidim who kept them out of Eastern Europe. But they finally penetrated the walls of Eastern Europe. All of a sudden, Hasidim and Misnagdim said, we agree on everything. There were small differences. Those small differences still exist in the 21st century also. But it was so insignificant compared to the bigger issue. The Reform of then is not like the Reform of today. The Reform of then was militant and aggressive, and if need be, violent and cruel. They wanted to reform the Jewish world, whether the Jews liked it or not, and if the Jews not willing to be reformed, they were going to be made to be reformed. And that is really the history of what brought Chassidim and Misnagdim together. It's not a nice way to tell the story. You want to tell the story that the great rabbis of the Chassidim and the great rabbis of the Misnagdim met, and they all realized how wonderful one another are. That's true too. That is true. But it was the backdrop that brought them together and created what was a real peace was the reform, was the tzaddas that happened, beginning, let's say, around the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. Life got very, very difficult for the Jewish people in Russia. And Hasidim and Tanya worked hand in hand until the Holocaust, on every project, hand in hand, on everything. There was no such thing as us and them. There was us and them, but not in terms of community service, in terms of how they were working with the community. But in the times of the Alter Rebbe, there was a terrible division amongst Jewish people. And the Misnagdim had tried every trick in the book to destroy Hasidus, because they saw it as an aberration, they saw it as outside the pale of Judaism, and they went as far as to include the government in their efforts to destroy Hasidus. And ultimately, they brought about the arrest of the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe sat in jail because there's Misnagdish informing against him. And we now have the documents. The documents were found and published in the last 20 years. When the Alter Rebbe was arrested, they arrested several other Hasidic Rebbes, Reb Chaim Chaikel Mehamdura and others, and scores of Hasidim were arrested. Many people were arrested. It wasn't a one person. It was like a sting. They arrested all the leaders. And the Misnagdim figured that this would be it. He will sit in jail, he'll be punished for his so-called crimes, and of course the Alter Rebbe was released from prison with honor. The government officials, all the way to the Tsar himself, who had arrested Alter Rebbe, saw him off with a great respect. They realized this is a brilliant man, a holy man, and they were in awe. They were in his respect in an incredible way. So for Hasidim it was a great victory. It was an incredible victory. It was an incredible victory really against great odds. It was a big nest. So the Alter Rebbe came home from this victory, he sat down and he wrote this letter. And the letter begins with the word Katainti mikol hachasadim mikol emes. I am humbled by all God's kindness and all of God's truth. And he puts forward a position to his Hasidim that the reaction that must be to the incredible blessings and gifts and kindness of God is an increase in humility. Instead of walking around and strutting around with pride and telling the Misnagdim, we won and you lost, he takes a very different position. He makes it very, very clear. As soon as he comes home from his liberation, he writes his Hasidim, do not show up the Misnagdim. This is not the right reaction. It's not a useful reaction. It's not a correct reaction. The correct response to an act of benevolence, an act of kindness, an act of generosity from God to man is not to feel more arrogant and more cocky and more self-assured, but to feel more humble. So he writes to his Hasidim, God has been good to us, and our reaction is that we should be more humbled by these graces. And we should not create an environment, we should not create a mood of arrogance and condescension and to exacerbate the divisions. And I'm going to explain this to you in very simple words. I'll tell you what it says here in this letter. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, all human beings have the capacity for humility. All of us go through humble moments, right? When do we feel humble? When we're out of a job, when we're rejected by somebody very close to ourselves. All of us feel very broken, very hurt, right? We all have had in our lifetimes moments of rejection, and we feel very humble. And if we have a little bit of an imagination, we flip the humility from feeling like a failure to feeling, oh, I'm such a pious guy, I feel so humble in front of God. It has nothing to do with God, it has to do with your own predicament. But people play games with themselves. On the other hand, we all have moments where we feel very self-assured. Success makes a person very proud, very cocky, very arrogant, very self-assured, very self-trusting. You know, there's an old Yiddish expression that says, Geld darf machen mishuggah, money has to make you crazy. If it has made you crazy, you simply haven't had enough. They say power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. At the heart of that is this arrogance. This sense of, look at I am such a smart guy. When I was in yeshiva, I had a yeshiva friend who was really, really, really destined to become a great businessman. I mean, he was into business. Anytime any person who had any success in business would show up in his vicinity, he would track him down and sit and talk to him. He was that kind of a person. He had a real feel for it. And he was buddy-buddy with all these rich guys and so on. He became a big shliach. He's not making a lot of money, making a lot of mitzvahs. It's one of the great miracles of my class that he became a shliach. The last person you would have thought to become a shliach. I mean, everybody thought he was going to be a millionaire. And I'm sure he's got more than 1 million in spiritual terms, But he's a mensch. There's no question about it. So he told me a story. He worshipped wealthy people. To him, a person made a lot of money was intelligent, was capable, was respectable, he says. There was a guy that he knew who had lost everything. He'd been incredibly wealthy, one of the richest Lubavitchers in the world. And he lost it. And he said to me how he changed his attitude towards this guy. When he had money, he honored him and he respected him and he thought he was like the hottest thing in town. And then when the guy lost his money and he would sit and talk, he would sit and make fun of him. He'd laugh at him. Until one day it crossed his mind. He said, "Son, look at me." He says, you lose your money, you lose your mind. This same man, 6 months before, a year ago, I would have sat and eaten his words like it was hot noodles. And now I'm mocking him. Why? Because I'm not respecting him, I'm respecting his wealth. And for him, this was it was a major wake-up call. It was a eureka moment in terms of his self-identity, who he was. And the same is with human nature. When things are good, we become very, very arrogant, very cocky, very self-assured. And who needs to be humble? I don't have to be humble, I'm successful. On the other hand, when people are down and in the dumps, they're automatically humble. This humility is not real humility, and this arrogance is not real arrogance. It's all artificial, it's not real. But this is human nature. So the Alter Rebbe says, the way God created the worlds of Klippa, they work as follows. When God smiles at Klippa, when God is generous to negative forces, to selfish forces, they become more self-assured, they become more full of themselves. And when God frowns on, when God distances himself, when God gives judgment to negative forces, then they're humble. They're humble in their lack, in their deficiencies, in their flaws, in their weaknesses, in their limits, in their arrogance and their wealth. Says the Rebbe, but that's not how Kedusha operates. In Kedusha, it's actually the other way around. And you have what amounts to one of the most important quotes in all of the Tanya. The Hebrew it's Aramaic more than Hebrew, Kol shul yoser kameyu yoser kalo. The closer one is to God, the humbler one gets. Kol shul yoser kameyu yoser kalo. The closer one is to God, the humbler they should become. Why? God gives. The gifts of God, the generosity is a sign of closeness to Hashem. When you're closer to Hashem, you are in the presence of real greatness. And in the presence of real greatness, all of whatever we are is humbled further. I'm going to give you a very interesting illustration for this. This is an illustration which has a halachic side, a legal side, and a very, very, very extensive spiritual side. In Judaism, there's a phenomenon called a king. A king. A king is a law. A king is a personality. A king is a position within the framework of Torah. Kings are political leaders, but kings are not political leaders that are elected. Kings are political leaders. Al pi Torah have what used to be called in medieval times divine right, power that comes from God. And if you study the laws of a king and you understand the dynamics of a king, something very, very interesting emerges. A king is the most powerful man in a country. His power is almost omnipotent. He can do almost anything he wants. He can even break certain rules. He has a right to break rules under certain conditions if it serves his purposes, if he needs it for himself, or for his government, or for his war effort, and so forth. So there's an incredible arrogance about a king. There's an incredible power about a king. Kings have to always appear in public in a way that dignifies them and intimidates the people. Kings are not allowed to be chum-chum. They're not allowed to be loose. They have to be aloof. They have to be removed. They have to be unavailable. They have to be distant. The same Torah that describes a king as having such arrogance says that there are a number of things that kings need to do to humble themselves more than any other Jew in the world. One of them is a king is required by Jewish law to constantly carry a Sefer Torah in his pocket. Not a mezuzah, not tefillin, a Sefer Torah. In his bosom pocket. A king walked around with a Sefer Torah on his person. He carried the Sefer Torah around with him. Now, you get aliyahs from time to time, you get to pick up the Sefer Torah. Every person who has any sensitivity, you're holding a Sefer Torah, there's a certain sense of apprehension. This is serious. Imagine carrying a Sefer Torah in your pocket. It's very unnerving. You know, there was a Jew before the Holocaust who was an unbelievably successful rabbi, very great man, and he felt that he was getting too carried away with himself, so he started carrying around the Sefer Torah. At the end of his life, he was always with the Sefer Torah, and he carried it for the express purpose of humbling himself. You know what this man was? Rabbi Meir Shapiro. The Lubliner Rav, he carried the Sefer Torah, there's pictures. At the end of his life, he always with the Sefer Torah. The law is that when a king would pray, king davens, so in the beginning of the Shemoneh Esrei, he would bend his head. We bend our head in the beginning and the end, otherwise we're supposed to keep our head erect. He kept his head bent the whole time. A king had to keep his head bent all davening. We're not allowed to do that. We don't have to, not allowed. Why? Because the only way that the king's sense of greatness in relationship to the people could be protected, could be guarded, could be healthy, it's if he is much more aware of his humility before God. He's a very powerful man. He's closer to God. He has to be more humble. His being above, his aloofness vis-a-vis his citizens, vis-a-vis his people, brings him in proximity to God Almighty, and the way he reacts to that is that he feels the presence of Hashem in a way that humbles him, in a way that doesn't humble anybody else. So there's two ways to look at it. The simple way to look at it is, since he has such a powerful position, he has to make every effort to humble himself. But mysticism and philosophy says it exactly the other way around. It's the king's humility to God that's the source of his power. How is it that a king is so much higher than everybody else? And the answer is because he's so humble in the presence of God. Because he's so close to God. And because he's so perpetually aware of that relationship. Like the Rambam's words, there's nobody above him but God himself. That humility is the source of his power. That humbling himself before God empowers him to lead the nation. So the Alter Rebbe says in Kedusha, the closer you are to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the humbler you are. And that's the story. Yaakov Avinu, our patriarch Jacob, has been given many gifts by God. And God has given him all kinds of promises. Now he's going to meet his brother Esav. Instead of his reaction being, God's helped me so much until now, he'll continue helping me in the future, and I'm going to teach my brother Esav a lesson, his response is, the closer one is to God, the more humble they are. And Yaakov felt inadequate, Yaakov felt undeserving, and Yaakov wasn't sure if the Eibush would give him additional blessing. Because in Kedusha, the closer one is to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the humbler they are. Let me give you a different analogy for the same. Let me give you a different way to say the same thing. What effect, I want you to think about this, what effect does knowledge have on people? Some people in this world are very smart. Most of us are not so smart. And there is a continental divide between the smart people and the rest of us. They live on a different planet. What effect does knowledge have on people?
Make them more important.
So, in the world as we know it, the reality is the intelligent people, the intellectuals, the smart people in the world are incredibly self-absorbed. They're very arrogant. They're very haughty. They're very pompous. They're very conceited. They don't even recognize anybody else. There's a certain sense of condescension. Chassidus says, knowledge humbles. Chassidus says, kol gei sheite. Any person who's arrogant is a fool. It's a pasuk. And knowledge humbles. How do you reconcile those two things?
The more you know, or what you think you know.
But the reality is,
Unless you don't know.
But the reality is that if you meet smart people, you meet professors and, people who collect and distribute knowledge as the center of their being, they're incredibly arrogant. They're very, very self-absorbed. And yet Chassidus says, that being arrogant is foolish, is the opposite of intelligence, and intelligence humbles a person. The answer to that question is there are several points, but one of the points is a very, very simple thing. When a person is in pursuit of knowledge, there's nothing more humbling than trying to get knowledge. As you put it, the more you know that you don't know. In other words, when you're in the pursuit of knowledge, it's very humbling. So if you are a human being whose definition is, I want to know, and this I want to know is incessant, this I want to know is unceasing, this I want to know is my definition, you'll be the humblest person in the world. But for many people, even though wanting to know is humbling, but they don't define themselves by what they don't know yet, they define themselves by what they know already. And that's why the pasuk says, Kol gei sheita, being arrogant is foolish. Because being arrogant means you're cutting yourself off from the pursuit of future knowledge. Because the prerequisite of future knowledge is humility. So Chassidus says, in Kedusha, knowledge humbles. In Klipa, knowledge creates an arrogance. Or to say it in more refined words, in Kedusha, since the knowledge and the knower are one, the knowledge humbles. In Klipa, since the knowledge and the knower are not one, the knower exploits the knowledge, and therefore the knowledge affects, instead of a humility, it affects the arrogant. So Alter Rebbe says the way of Kedusha is that when you see the hand of God, that means God is closer to you, the reaction to that must be a humbling of self. And therefore he says, the Eibush has made a great miracle, and it was a very big miracle. You have to understand, there was the establishment. Chassidus was anti-establishment. Hakodesh was the new kid on the block. Hakodesh was the revolution. And the government of Russia recognized the establishment. In other words, in Russia there was no separation between church and state. Religious clergy, rabbis, had official political power from the government, sanctioned by the king himself all the way down. And as a result, if the establishment to a certain position, and along comes Hasidus and is fighting against the establishment and criticizing the establishment and finding flaws and weaknesses in the establishment and creating a new movement, the fact that the government of Russia recognized the legitimacy of Hasidus and the Alter Rebbe and declared unequivocally, Hasidus is not a new religion, it's in fact a resurgence or a rejuvenation, a renewal of the old values and old traditions of what Yiddishkeit is. It was a great ness. Says Alter Rebbe, what should our reaction be? Humility. We could make fun of them as Nagdim, we can put them down, we can say, ha, we won, you lost. So after that, but that's not Kedusha. That's Klipa, that's the human. The reaction of Kedusha is that we must humble ourselves. Humble ourselves in relationship with our foes. In other words, in relationship with the Misnagdim, instead of being arrogant and condescending, we should be accepting. But the root of that humility should be our sense of appreciation to the Eibishter. When we really recognize the incredible kindness of God, which is the source of this great miracle, this great event, that awareness is, by its very, very nature, humbling. It makes us feel more humble. And being arrogant is separating ourselves from that awareness. It's important that our reaction should be that it should humble us. And you have, in the Tanya, an interesting conclusion. The Rebbe says, what are we going to gain by being humble? First of all, we're going to be doing the right thing. And you got to do the right thing. And he says the words, B'midas emes liyankiv. The right thing is to employ the midah of emes, the attribute of truth, which is the midah of Yankov Avinu. In other words, there's an expression of the Hayom Yom in the Rebbe's little pamphlet of Hasidic thoughts, that when Alter Rebbe wrote this letter that we're learning tonight, he said that the humility has to be in truth. We have to humble ourselves in truth. Be'emes, midah emes liyankiv. So it says in the Siches that had the Alter Rebbe not written these three words, B'midas, Emes, Yankiv, he would have had 50,000 additional Hasidim. Had he not written these three words, that the humility has to be true, he would have 50,000 more Hasidim. And of course the question becomes, what happens? 3 words equals 50,000 Hasidim? And of course the answer is not the 3 words, it's the message of the 3 words. That in Hasidus Chabad has to be Mtanemes. And true humility is not acted humility. In other words, don't just act humble because you got a letter from the Alter Rebbe, be nice. Be truly humble. So that when you create a Hasidus based on Midas Emes, that obsesses over the real truth, you have a much harder time finding a following. Not everybody is able to stand up to the rigors, to the test of what it means, Avodas Hashem Adarach Emes, serving Hashem with an Emes. At another point, he says, he says, if we'll be nice to the misnagdim, maybe we can stop this fight. Ultimately, the point is we want to embrace our opponents. We want there should be shalom amongst the Jews. In a very real way, it was a one-way fight. Chassidim were not trying to destroy the misnagdim, they were trying to survive. Alter Rebbe says, if we will humble ourselves and not react with the natural, ordinary response to such an event by becoming arrogant and self-absorbed and full of ourselves and so forth and so on, perhaps we will succeed in bringing the misnagdim closer. In other words, not only will we be doing the right thing, we'll actually be embracing somebody closer to Hasidus. And if we don't succeed, we'll be doing the right thing anyway. So the Rebbe writes in this Iggeres Hakodesh that it's incredibly important that when we witness the hand and kindness of Hashem, our reaction should be one of kindness rather than one of arrogance and self-absorption and so forth and so on. And this is an unbelievably real and practical lesson in life. And it's not an easy one to learn. And I can give you 1,000 examples for this. I can give you 1,000 examples of this. People try so hard to succeed. And then they finally succeed. And then what happens? Aspects of their personality that are not so pretty emerge. This is the nature of success. Success is a new challenge. I saw in a book of quotes, if you think God thinks money is a good idea, just look at whom He gave it. You think God thinks money is a good thing, look to whom He gave it. But it's not the people became who they are because of the people who were what they are and therefore they got money. The money made them that way. Take away their wealth, give it to somebody else, and the same thing happens there. Power, success, wealth has an incredibly challenging effect on a person. It's a good thing, and you shouldn't shy away from it. But success and power and influence are they're very, very dangerous things. Because what they do is they allow us to allow parts of ourselves that are ugly, that we would normally suppress because people would not put up with it. But now, because of our power, because of our success, and because of our wealth, we can get away with it. They emerge, and we don't recognize ourselves. And some of us don't even care. You make it, you're successful. So yeah, I'm a mean, ugly, arrogant person, and I should make fun of you and put you down because I'm richer and more powerful and more respected than you. And if you're a real person, and you succeeded, and you discover these negative midas in yourself that you didn't know you had, you say, oh my gosh, I didn't know such an ugly person. And a whole new avodah emerges. Because the way it works, I always tell this to people, what is the difficulty in being a genius? Why is it so hard to be head and shoulders above everybody else? Whether it's in learning, or it's in physical fitness, or it's in any area. Why is it very difficult to be excellent? There's a very, very simple answer. The Eibishter designed society is a competitive model. We rub shoulders. You and your equals, your friends, your classmates, those who are of a similar age or in a similar profession or a similar level of intelligence and education, you rub shoulders against one another. And the nature of this rubbing of shoulders it doesn't allow anybody to get too carried away with themselves, because the pack holds you in the pack. You can't start deluding yourself into thinking you're the next Einstein, because there's about 50 other Einsteins that are willing to show you how dumb you are. What happens if you're actually Einstein? So you're on a pedestal. You're on a pedestal. You're on a pedestal because of one area of genius. You're good at physics. You can't tie your shoes, maybe. You can't cook breakfast. And then what happens is you're put in a place where you have this gift which makes you greater than everybody else. So you're no longer experiencing the regular grinding, the regular rubbing shoulders, regular friction that exists in society, and you become a pariah. You live in this protected world where you can be as ugly and as mean and as selfish and even as cruel as you want, because you're exceptional in this way. So the Rebbe says, Klippa says, why not? I made it. And Gedusha says, Not only is that wrong, but the reaction should be exactly the opposite. Success is supposed to humble a person. It's a very, very, very difficult challenge. Any person who's ever had success in anything knows how incredibly difficult it is to, quote, stay normal in the face of success. Whether it's financial success, or it's political success, or it's success in any area. And the Alter Rebbe is saying this is Kedusha. Why is it Kedusha? Because Kedusha is the recognition that it's God who gave you this. And not only God who gave it to you, but this gift is a closeness to God. This gift is a kiruv. It's an intimacy with God. And this closeness with God humbles, because in the presence of God we're all very small. So some people become successful, and you see ugliness within themselves that you never imagined were there. And other people become successful, and you see goodness, and you see humility that was unimaginable, because they were able to remember that all their success comes from the Eibishter, and instead of it making them more arrogant and more self-absorbed and all their ugliness emerging, it made them closer to the Eibishter, and they brought a humility out of themselves. It's a very, very profound and relevant message. So although the story of this Iggeres Hakodesh may have happened 200 years ago, once upon a time, the Hasidim and the Misnagdim had a terrible struggle. The Misnagdim had the Alter Rebbe arrested, and they thought they would get the Alter Rebbe put away forever, and that would be the end of Hasidus. The Alter Rebbe was released from prison after 53 days, and Hasidim was so proud, and the Alter Rebbe says, this is an act of benevolence from the Creator of the world. And the natural reaction to the benevolence of God is humility on the part of those who are the recipients of that benevolence, of that kindness. But there's a couple of more things I want to tell you. In conclusion, one of them is that in the Rebbe's Sichos, Rebbe's talks on humility, he makes a very, very, very important point. And this is a really very realistic point also. And that is, he separates the Hebrew word anava from the Hebrew word shiflus. Anava and shiflut. There are two Hebrew words. Anava means humility. Shiflus means lowliness. And what's the difference between being a humble person and a low person? I would say a low person means someone who has issues with self-esteem.
No self-image, right?
Right. In other words, a low person says, I'm nothing. I could be a genius and a millionaire and talented and creative and capable. I'm a nothing. I'm a doormat. A humble person doesn't say I'm nothing. A humble person knows exactly who he is. A humble person appreciates the gifts God gave him. The humble person simply recognizes that everything he has from Hashem. Like it says in Hasidus that Moshe Rabbeinu was the humblest man who ever lived. What does that mean? Moshe didn't know he was Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know that God gave him the Torah. Nobody but Moshe can get the Torah. Not even Mashiach. Like it says in Rambam. Only Moshe Rabbeinu got it from the Eibishter. Moshe said a very simple thing. Yes, I'm Moshe Rabbeinu. But if God had given anybody else the gifts He gave me, they would have been a better Moshe Rabbeinu than I am. So, in other words, humility doesn't mean I lie to myself. Humility doesn't mean I imagine a lowliness of self which is dishonest. That's called shiflus, a lowliness, which is not a healthy thing. Another means I know exactly who I am. And nevertheless, I recognize that since everything I have, I get from Hashem, so the more Hashem gives me, the smaller it makes me feel, the humbler it makes me feel. I had in my house a Shabbat Brachas on Friday night, and we were talking about the word pashtus. Yeah, some people are gifted with the capacity for being ordinary. Geniuses, rabbis, scholars, successful people. And yet they have the ability to be simple in their relations with everybody else. That's a real symptom, it's a real sign of humility. And this explains a very weird Gemara that Rebbe brings in the Sichos. The Gemara says in the end of Masechta Sotah, there's a whole list of things that the Gemara enumerates, that when this rabbi died, this attribute passed. When this rabbi died, this attribute passed. In other words, the Mishnah is listing how over the course of time so many special qualities departed. And one of the things the Gemara says is that at a certain point there are no more humble people. Mishamei so and so ain't batlan nova. So you have Rab Nachman and one other person, I think it's Abzeira, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi says, Leitis na nova dikano. They said when this rabbi passed away, humility died with him. So two rabbis said, excuse me, no, that's not true. I'm humble. Do not say that when Rabbi so-and-so died, humility died, I'm humble. So the Rebbe asked the obvious question, for a rabbi to say humility didn't die, I'm humble, is the antithesis to humility. What kind of humble man is he if he's announcing he's humble? And of course the answer is, humility doesn't mean I tell myself I'm nothing. Humility says that since I know whatever I have from the Eibishter, I don't attribute my greatness to myself. And therefore a person can honestly say of himself that he's humble. Because the symptom of the humility is not that he doesn't know who he is, but it's the complete recognition that it all comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It all comes from Hashem. And I want to finish off the class with a very compelling story. It's a compelling story. Evidently the story is true, but it's a very, very compelling story. And the story goes like this. The Alter Rebbe, the Chabad of Chabad movement, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Chabad Rebbe, actually used to travel around to try and recruit Hasidim. Or to say it in other words, that he felt that he had an obligation, since he was the founder of the Hasidic movement in Russia, he had an obligation to go to where the Misnagdim lived and engage them in debates. Misnagdim had many complaints to Hasidus, they had objections, they disagreed, and so forth. He felt that he has an obligation to go and meet them and, as they say in the world, dialogue, discuss. In later generations, the Rabbi used to say, whatever discussions needed to be done were already done. Hasidus doesn't have to defend himself anymore. But the Alter Rebbe was the first, and he felt he has to go to where the Misnagdim lived and defend himself. He traveled to all the big British cities. He even tried to go to Vilna. But he was in Shklov, he was in Minsk, he was in Pinsk. He went to all these famous Litvish cities, and he met their rabbis and engaged them in conversations. One of the places that he visited on a number of occasions was the city of Shklov. Shklov was second only to Vilna in the greatness of Torah in Europe at the time. When he came and left Shklov, scores of young men became his Hasidim. One of the people who became a Chassid, Alter Rebbe, was a very, very great man, an incredibly great scholar and mystic and servant of God named Pinchas Shik. His family name was Shik. Since the Pinchas Shik lived in Shklov, they called him also the Pinchas Shklover. So he had two last names. But he had a third last name as well. The last name by which Hasidim called him was not the Pinchas Shik, not the Pinchas Shklover. Instead, they called him the Pinchas Roses. Roses means rose. Who was Rose? His mother-in-law. Hasidim called him the Pinchas Roses. There was two Hasidim who were called Roses. The Pinchas Roses was another Roses. Why? She was a very wealthy woman. When Alter Rebbe came to Shklov, she was very taken by the Alter Rebbe. She told her son-in-laws, if you'll go to this rabbi, I'll give you a lot of money. So he went, and he gave the Alter Rebbe all the money. After he gave Alter Rebbe all the money that his mother-in-law gave him. He was a very, very rich man. Pinchas Roses. So Chassidim called him Pinchas Roses. She made him Mentachas. His father was a Henechshik. He was the Av Bezdin of Shklov, a great Torah scholar, an incredible Talmud Chacham. But he was a Misnagid, he was against Chassidus. But you see, in those days, many people who were Misnagdim hated Chassidus so much that when they, God forbid, their children would become Chassidim, it is hard to imagine, they would literally sit Shiva. It was like joining another religion. Rabbi Shik was a Misnagid, but he wasn't an idiot. He knew Chassidim are Jews. He disagreed with the approach of Chassidus, the study of mysticism, the breaking the barriers between the rabbis and the simple people, and so forth. But he knew Chassidim were good Jews, and his son was a Chassid, but they talked. So he was very unhappy that his son had become a Chassid. And he was constantly engaging his son in conversation to get to the bottom of it. So what exactly did you learn in Chassidus? So this was a chronic argument, the same argument over and over again. These were two geniuses, you understand? Two masters of Torah, and they had plenty of different ways of sparring the same wrestle. So on one of the many occasions when the father asks the son exactly what you get in Chassidus, so the son tells his father, I learned what humility means. So the father says, you mean to tell me that if you don't study Chassidus, you can't know what humility is? He says, that's right. He says, well, guess what? I'm going to learn humility. I'm going to study ethical works, Musar, Svarim. Specifically, I'll study those ethical works based on Kabbalah, like the Reishis Chochmah and others. And I'll be humble without having studied Chassidus. So the son says, okay, let's see. So the father spent a few weeks, a few months studying all these ethical works, talking about humility. And he told the son, I think I know what humility means. So the following Friday, the son pulled off one of his classic practical jokes. His father had a shamish. His father had a servant. He says to his father's servant, this Friday, when my father comes out of his office to go to the mikveh, and he offers you his laundry, tell him, listen, Rabbi, 20 years I served you, today you're going to serve me. Let him carry your bag. You go to the mikveh, let him help you with your shoes. And Bezim did in Schwitz. Let him, you'll be the rabbi and he'll be the shamish. Anyway, the Benachshik comes out of his room on Friday, And he approaches his shamish and he gives him his bag, and the shamish says, Rabbi, 20 years I've been schlepping your bag. Today you schlep mine. You'll be the shamish and I'm going to be the rabbi. So the Henach Shik, of course, understood this was his son's challenge. So he took the challenge. He took the bag and he followed behind his shamish, who strutted along like this proud guy, came to the mikveh, helped him with his boots, he helped him with his clothing. He did whatever he had to do. Anyway, the Henach Shik was so thoroughly embarrassed, it's indescribable. When they returned home, he called his son, the Pinchas. He says, you see, I never studied Hasidus and I passed a test of humility. So the son said to the father, tell me, Tata, tell me the truth. When you were going through that test, what were you feeling? He says, what was I feeling? That if I had a dagger, I'd run him through. That's what I was thinking. He says, had you been a chassid, you would not have felt that what was occurring was abnormal. Had not have felt that what was happening was not right. Now, it's a story. It's a very dramatic story. But it's also poignantly true. In other words, Hasidus teaches that humility is not a series of exercises. It's a condition. And the deeper concept Hasidus teaches is that humility is not what you do, but humility is what you're connected to. Like the Meir Mishlana used to say, if you're connected on high, you don't fall. Humility is rooted in when you're connected to the Eibishter. Humility is not something you bring onto yourself. Your closeness to the Eibishter is the source. The humility comes from the fact that you're close to Hashem. When you're close to the Eibishter, you're humble.
Wasn't he close to the Eibishter?
He was a big gon. He was very frum.
Why his?
But Avdin and the
act
Eibishter.
of a novel was not genuine. You're talking about the Rosh Bezdin?
It was an act of another. That's the whole point.
How do you know it's not genuine?
He said so. At Chalek Yizot.
He said that?
It's a machzedek. The third Lubavitcher Rebbe.
What's the difference between shiftless and hispatlus? How does that interfere?
It depends how you translate the word hisbatlus. It could be either. It could be one or the other. The answer, there's a lashon in Maimonides Hasidus. There's an expression in Hasidus. There's a very big difference between an empty vessel and a vessel with a hole. An empty vessel you could fill. A vessel with a hole is a waste of time to fill. And that's what you have to be weary of the vessel having a hole. I just want to finish with this story. It's okay. The story. I want to finish the story. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, in Russia in his times, was a Rebbe of incredible success. Fantastic success. I mean, the story that we hear, he was a Rebbe over 1 million Chassidim. That doesn't mean that literally 1 million people came to Lubavitch. It meant that all of Russia was devoted to his beliefs and his leadership. He was a very powerful Rebbe. And he had a collection of Rabbonim, who were his Chassidim, who were Go'oinim Mamish. A whole army of rabbis who were in their own right great scholars who were his Chassidim. And the tradition of those days were that they used to gather in Lubavitch on Shavuos. So Shavuos in Lubavitch was a sight to see, and all these incredible Talmidei Chachamim all gathered together at one table, and the Rebbe would oversee the congregation. And the minhag was that the first day Shavuos, they used to eat milchiks, as you know, milchiks and fleshiks. And the milchik meal that the Tzemach Tzedek served, they didn't wash, was called the nigletish, the scholarly table. All the rabbis, the Bali Nigla, the Rosh Hashivas, the Rabbanim would get together, and they would eat milchiks. They didn't wash, they ate mezenis. And the Rabbi used to present an idea in Nigla, and they would talk. It was never very long, half an hour, 45 minutes. It wasn't hours and hours, but this was... So on one occasion, one of these nigletishs, and he turns to one of his sons and says, here, drink it. So the young man tells his father, I can't drink that, it's poison. So he takes the same cup and offers it to another one of his children and says, here, drink. Nobody wants to drink it. And the Rebbe himself poured this glass, so there's probably all kinds of kavanas in it, but nobody could drink it. It was undrinkable. And he went around to a bunch of his children, and when he finished with his children, he offered the same glass to some of the most prominent Chassidim. Nobody could drink it. At this table, at the edge, is sitting a Chacham by the name of Reb Noten. He also was a great Goan, very big Talmid Chacham, great scholar. He was a Chassid from the Mittel Rebbe. The Mittel Rebbe used to say that he properly reared only 2 Chassidim, the people Paltiel and Reb Noten Mel Stritzen. So he was this chassid of Nata. He was a big Talmud Chacham. He was a big chassid, but he was also very humble. So Tzaddik says, pass it down to Nata, he says. And he says in Yiddish, Nata is ayin, and ayin is neisei hafchid. Which means in English he says, Nata, this person Nata, he's nothing. He takes up no room. Nothing can tolerate contradictions. So they pass down this toxic cup to the back of the table. They tell the Nata, the Rebbe said to drink it, and he downs it. He drinks it. And then later the Hasidim said, you heard the compliment, the Rebbe gave you such an incredible compliment. The Rebbe said that you're so humble that you're like nothing. He says, yeah, it's true, I am nothing. I'm absolutely nothing. In other words, in Yiddish, he says, Gonesh, abetaka Gonesh. He didn't even hear a compliment. All he heard was the Rebbe said he's a nobody. The Rebbe's point was that his status of nobody was quite a somebody, but that didn't register with him. He heard only the idea of nothing. And the real truth of the matter is, as I said before, real humility is rooted in connection to higher. Real humility has to do with being connected to the Meibishter.